Hello, and welcome back to Cade's Arcade. I'm Cade. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was a fantastic launch title for the Nintendo Switch. It featured numerous improvements with the gameplay that propelled Zelda into the next generation. But one criticism that kinda plagued the game was the lack of a soundtrack. Yes, I'm aware that Breath of the Wild does have music, I don't mean to insinuate that it doesn't, but you can't deny that for the majority of the adventure, you'll mostly hear various ambient noises such as birds chirping or the swaying of tree branches off in the distance. Personally, the omission of background music didn't exactly bother me, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss listening to an overworld theme as I trek across the expansive fields of Hyrule. Before I go any further, I want to clarify one simple thing. This is not a review of Breath of the Wild. I mean, as if the thumbnail didn't make that painfully obvious. So, you might be wondering, why the crap am I talking about Breath of the Wild? I only bring it up because I aim to draw a contrast between it and the other Zelda title I will be focusing on. I am, of course, talking about Cadence of Hyrule, as well as Crypt of the Necrodancer, but mostly Cadence of Hyrule. Where Breath of the Wild seemed to be lacking in the music department, Cadence of Hyrule makes up for this by having the music the focal point. Cadence of Hyrule, released on June 13th, 2019 exclusively on the Nintendo Switch by Brace Yourself Games. It was a follow-up to the developer's previous and only title, Crypt of the Necrodancer, released on April 23rd, 2015. The backstory goes that Brace Yourself Games founder, Ryan Clark, approached Nintendo with the intention of including Zelda characters as DLC for the Switch port of their original indie hit. Not only was Nintendo on board with the collaboration, but the idea quickly evolved into its own game in the form of, you guessed it, Cadence of Hyrule. When I first saw Cadence of Hyrule revealed in March of 2019 during a Nintendo Indie Showcase, I fell in love with the concept immediately. And can you blame me? It's a rhythm-based Zelda game. It combines two of my favorite things about this medium. So, naturally, I just had to get my hands on it ASAP, which I did when it launched. So, fun fact, I actually wrote this review back in February of this year. And I'm just now getting to the video, because life likes to be complicated sometimes. Regardless, everything I point out in this video should still hold up now as it did then. Let's take a look at Cadence of Hyrule, Crypt of the Necrodancer featuring The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo Switch. Okay, look, this is where I would normally summarize the plot of a game to give you context for the points I'm about to make. But I am going to try something a little different this time by just going straight into my thoughts while keeping it as spoiler-free as possible. Well, as much as I can, but I digress. As far as story is concerned, Cadence of Hyrule features a very rudimentary Zelda plot. The land of Hyrule is in chaos, Link and Zelda collect the game's MacGuffin, beat the villain, and save the land with the Triforce. Honestly, I'm not sure what you'd expect from a Zelda game at this point story-wise. Now, there is one interesting detail about the story I don't want to spoil here. Yes, the game has been out for a while, but still. Now, it's nothing super amazing that you need to get the game for ASAP. It's just more a neat little detail I think people would get more out of if they experience it firsthand, like I did. Moving on, I can't talk about Cadence of Hyrule and not mention the music. Regardless of what I might like or dislike, it's safe to say the music is on point and is easily the best part about the whole experience. If you recall, I mentioned in my Owl's Awakening review how I'm a sucker for remixes. As someone who has a particular soft spot for video game remixes, and I really wasn't lying, almost every song featured in Cadence of Hyrule is a remix of various soundtracks throughout the history of the Zelda franchise. I loved the musical composition of Cadence of Hyrule so much that I'm listening to it as I'm rewriting this review. And if there's anything that Brace Yourself Games is known for, it's music. And this shouldn't come as a surprise, but Brace Yourself Games were also heavily inspired by Zelda when they were working on Crypt of the Necrodancer. Now, in Cadence of Hyrule, you won't find any new Zelda tracks in game, aside from Octopo's theme, who is the main villain. And personally, I'm glad that there aren't any. Cadence of Hyrule, to me, comes off as a game made by fans of the Zelda series celebrating its rich history. In order to prepare myself for Cadence of Hyrule, I decided to delve into their original title, Crypt of the Necrodancer. While I knew going in Brace Yourself Games was known for their excellent soundtracks, I was not prepared for how catchy Crypt of the Necrodancer's music would be. I dare you to have a listen and not bob your head to the beat of the music. To go the extra mile, Brace Yourself Games made multiple versions of the same tracks in both of their titles. I realize this is a common practice, especially nowadays, but just let me elaborate. In a single level, you'll hear an arrangement when fighting enemies, a variation when it's peaceful, when you pause the game, even the shopkeeper can be heard singing along. Again, that's just for a single track, and Cadence of Hyrule alone features over 20 unique songs to listen to. I've provided a link to a playlist for your listening pleasure. Now, I'd like to rewind for a second. I just gotta say, I love the fact that the shopkeeper in both games will sing along to the background music if you get close enough to his shop. This is one of those unnecessary but welcome details I've mentioned time and time again. I could go on and on and on about the music, but it's time to transition to the actual game. Between Crypt of the Necrodancer and Cadence of Hyrule, the gameplay is roughly the same. You have a grid-based layout, and you either attack or move by using the D-pad. You could use the analog stick, but a D-pad will give you more accuracy, at least in my opinion. In addition, you have to move to the beat of the music, and the enemies all follow the same limitation. This is where the bulk of the challenge comes from. If you can't keep to the beat, then you may find these games to be a little more difficult than you might like. Right off the bat, I have never played any game quite like this. Honestly, it's kind of weird having the attack button also be the same one you move with. But as odd as it may seem, I did actually find it intuitive. But I'm also super weird and actually like quote-unquote gimmicky controls. So, that one might just be me. Sure, it took a little getting used to initially, but landing those attacks in time with the music is so incredibly satisfying. I can't begin to accurately illustrate just how satisfying it is without first shoving a controller in your hands and having you play it yourself. While there are many mechanics that are shared between the two games, there's plenty of changes the developer made to Cadence of Hyrule that improves on the Crypt of the Necrodancer formula. For example, Cadence of Hyrule is structured like a classic Zelda game, whereas Crypt of the Necrodancer is a tried and true roguelike experience. You might be thinking, what is a roguelike game? Well, I'm glad you asked. Usually, they're a procedurally generated dungeon crawler where you gain progression in death. The more you die, the more gets unlocked, which will make you stronger over time. I realize that's a gross simplification of this niche subgenre, but it's all you really need to know for what I'm talking about. Another thing to understand is roguelikes aren't meant to be 50-hour-long epics, but rather, they're to be experienced in short bursts. In a lot of ways, they're very reminiscent of old-school arcade games. By that, I mean arcade games were brutally designed to make you die quickly to eat up all your quarters. Also, roguelikes, they've been around since before video games were even a thing. Their influence can be traced back to classic tabletops like Dungeons and Dragons. That's why I'm kinda surprised that more gamers haven't heard of them. And that's also why I feel the need to bring everyone watching this video up to speed. To reiterate, Cadence of Hyrule is designed more like a classic Zelda game, whereas Crypt of the Necrodancer is a tried and true roguelike experience. For instance, the layout of Cadence of Hyrule has an actual overworld that's ready for you to explore any way you want, which is akin to Zelda on the NES and even Breath of the Wild to an extent. Crypt of the Necrodancer, on the other hand, features a small hub area containing various rooms for shop or training, in addition to the stairs that lead to the game's 5 levels. Like I said, roguelikes are not very long. Despite Crypt of the Necrodancer not being a lengthy experience, the playtime gets extended with its difficulty. It can be a brutal challenge at times. Another thing to keep in mind is that one major mechanic in both of these games is that it really plays more like a giant game of chess that's constantly in motion. On a side note, one of the bosses in Crypt of the Necrodancer is a literal chess set, and I freaking love it so much. Anyways, side tangent aside, with the enemies, it's up to you to learn the fighting styles and patterns of each and every enemy type. Much like how in a real game of chess, you have to understand the mechanics of every piece on the board. And this is where the training rooms come in. I suspect Brace Yourself Games knew how difficult Crypt of the Necrodancer can be, and felt the need to throw in the training rooms. They even go as far as letting you practice against the game's various bosses. On the flip side, Cadence of Hyrule was significantly easier to complete. But the thing is, I didn't mind the difficulty of either game. With Crypt of the Necrodancer, while it proved to be a bit of a feat, it never once made me want to chuck the controller at my TV. And Cadence of Hyrule did have some difficult parts, but it was a pretty casual experience throughout. For context, I started with Cadence of Hyrule, and while I didn't exactly have the hardest time with it, I had an interesting experience adjusting to the gameplay. Due to not knowing what to expect prior, it added a layer of challenge to the game by having to figure out the rhythm mechanics on top of the combat. If you're interested in playing Cadence of Hyrule, I strongly recommend trying out Crypt of the Necrodancer first, just purely for the gameplay. When I eventually played through Crypt of the Necrodancer and understood how the game worked, it gave me a newfound appreciation when I returned to Cadence of Hyrule. Now, I'm going to briefly list off a few changes between the two games because I don't want to make this review longer than it needs to be. Both games have you collect diamonds, which you use to buy things like permanent upgrades. When you die, you're taken to a shop where you can spend diamonds you've collected. The main difference being Crypt of the Necrodancer offers better rewards when you die. You're just forced to either throw away all your diamonds or spend them before you continue. Cadence of Hyrule, on the other hand, lets you keep what you've collected, but what you have available to purchase when you die is minimal. You can still buy better permanent upgrades in Cadence of Hyrule, but those are all found throughout the overworld, like a classic Zelda game. Another difference, the procedural generation. Generally, it does work the same between both games. The dungeons get generated when you either first enter them or die. However, Cadence of Hyrule's overworld randomly generates once when you start a new game, similar to how a map in Minecraft gets randomly generated every time you create a new world. That means every playthrough will have a different layout. You can't just simply memorize item locations. I could see this being a pain for speedrunning, but when it has a little RNG, stop the speedrunner. The next difference, Cadence of Hyrule features objects with durability, which is a mechanic pulled right out of Breath of the Wild. So, if you hate dealing with breakable items like how most games are doing nowadays, then I'm sorry, I'm not sure what to tell you there. However, Crypt of the Necrodancer does not feature items with durability. Now, there are glass items present in both games where they have increased strength but break if you take 1 point of damage. But when you get items like a shovel or a torch in Crypt of the Necrodancer, it doesn't wear out. You keep it for good. At least until you trade it for something better. One last difference I want to mention. Crypt of the Necrodancer has a ton of characters to play with, all featuring different abilities. Cadence of Hyrule only features Link, Zelda, and Cadence. Nevertheless, many of the abilities tied to each character in Crypt of the Necrodancer are still present in Cadence of Hyrule. They're just mostly buried in the game's menu. Later on, Brace Yourself Games did add several characters to Cadence of Hyrule's playable roster, but at the time of writing this review, I have yet to play with them. When I get around to trying out their gameplay, if it changes the game enough in any meaningful way, then I will consider making a mini review just to update that one aspect. Moving on, there's one ability in particular that made such a huge difference with the gameplay that I felt it was worth talking about for a minute. Now, I know there's a lot of you out there that are not into rhythm games, which, is understandable. Brace Yourself Games also put that into consideration and provided an option that lets you turn on what they call fixed beat mode, which allows you to move freely without the worry of sticking to the rhythm. I was not the same when I turned it on. You might be thinking, what's the point in turning it on? I thought they were supposed to be rhythm games. And you're not wrong in that assumption. While the music and feeling the beat is certainly the focus of these games, they're not the point. They are first and foremost roguelike action-adventure dungeon crawlers that just so happen to feature rhythm elements. How you enable fixed beat mode is different for both games. In Crypt of the Necrodancer, you have to play as Bard. For Cadence of Hyrule, they made it an option in the settings. Fixed beat mode essentially changes the game into a pseudo real-time tactics game, giving the whole experience a completely different feel. Now it does dumb down the difficulty a tad, but only by removing one element among the dozens of mechanics you're going to be juggling around. Like I said earlier, there's something cathartic about chaining a combo to the beat of the music. So if you turn on fixed beat mode, you would miss out on this aspect of the game. But there is fun to be had with it enabled, so it's up to you. You do you, my dude. Cadence of Hyrule was a refreshing game for me to experience. It combined my love of music with my nostalgic ties to Zelda. It was an experience I never asked for, but glad I was given the opportunity to play. If I had to give any real criticism, the game wasn't long enough. I understand the nature of a roguelike isn't meant to be super long, but come on. I beat it in about 5 hours without much effort on my first playthrough. I would have liked to see a New Game Plus mode, just something to give me an incentive to want to go through it twice. without it getting too repetitive. As for Crypt of the Necrodancer, it was an innovative title that has a lot to offer in terms of challenge and concept, but doesn't quite feature enough depth in its content to have me coming back. I'm not saying I dislike Crypt of the Necrodancer. It was more the whole experience got redundant after a while in ways that rubbed me the wrong way. There is replay value in the form of multiple characters to play as, but it comes at the cost of having to start at the beginning with each character. I wouldn't mind going through the game again if the levels themselves changed to fit the theme of each and every person you play as, but Crypt of the Necrodancer never does that. And when you have over a dozen characters to choose from, it can become a bit of a drag. Honestly, I would have taken less playable characters if it means having interesting New Game Plus like experiences with each character to unlock. Overall, I really enjoyed my time with both titles. Even so, I can't lie, I enjoyed Cadence of Hyrule way more than Crypt of the Necrodancer. From the overworld to the general layout feeling like a classic Zelda game, Cadence of Hyrule hit all of the right points for me. Not to mention, hearing the remixes of all the iconic Zelda songs was a pleasant experience I am more than happy to listen to over and over again. Call it biased, but it is what it is. Real talk, reviews such as this one are nothing more than opinions based in biases colored by the reviewer's experience. And this reviewer happened to grow up with a lot of Zelda games and had a piano teacher for a mother. Instead of judging a game's replayability, I will instead be rating games based on if I personally recommend them or not. With all that said, my personal recommendation for Crypt of the Necrodancer is worth a try, but not so much a full playthrough. As for Cadence of Hyrule, I strongly recommend giving it a playthrough from start to finish. That is, if you're into rhythm and or Zelda games. Now remember, reviews are opinions that should never be taken as your own. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care.